You may remember last month we took a look at the very best from AMD and Intel in terms of gaming. The 5800X3D versus the 12900K. And the results were actually really interesting, especially given the nature of how much each part cost and how close the performance was. Now, when it came to gaming, you could argue that there was a clear-cut winner, but with no real room for future-proofing, the Intel top-tier SKU still had room for arguing why it was better. Now, one comment that did come up a lot was another SKU from Intel, the 12700K. Now, considering it comes in quite a bit cheaper than the 5800X3D and actually has room for giving some form of longevity on the platform, could it be enough to make it the world's best gaming CPU? Before we find out, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. You call me the stupid one. Now, I don't want to stomp over old ground in terms of why we did this and why we did that, because all of that good stuff can be found in the 5800X3D versus 12900K video, so definitely check that one out. Now, one thing I do want to make clear is that we tried to make our testing as fair as humanly possible, and with the likes of the 12700K supporting the likes of DDR5, that already gives it a somewhat superior edge over the AMD based chip. With that in mind and wanting to stay, let's say, consistent, we tested both chips on the same Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB 32 gig 3600MHz dual channel memory. In terms of the motherboard, again, keeping things consistent, we used the MSI MAG Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi DDR4 for the Intel test bench, and for the AMD system, we used the MSI MPG X570S Edge Max Wi-Fi. Due to the high-end nature of both these systems, we tested using the Gigabyte RTX 3080 Game & OC graphics card, and resizable bar was disabled for all of our tests. Now, before we get into the benchmarks, it's worth noting that due to prices changing daily, that at the time of filming, we based our pricing at £380 in the UK and $400 in the US for the 12700K, and £439 in the UK and $448 in the US for the 5800X3D. This is actually important because at the end we'll be discussing cost per frame. Now, as always, we'll be putting all this data onto our Patreon, so if you fancy signing up to see it there, among getting a ton of other benefits and actually seeing more testing data, including as well, you'll get perks on our super special Minecraft server, then the link is down below. That aside, let's get on with our first test. Starting with Assassin's Creed, set to the ultra high preset at 1080p, we saw a very small difference in frame rate between the two chips, with the 5800X3D taking a slight lead of only a single frame in the average FPS, while the 1% low was similar with only a single frame's difference, but this time in favour of the 12700K. The differences were small to say the least, but at 1440p the gap gets even slimmer, as the average FPS became a measly 0.08 frames per second apart from each other, again with a slight advantage to the 5800X3D. Then at 4K our results were once again very close to each other, with barely a 2 frame difference in the averages. General performance in Assassin's Creed is so close between the two CPUs that you wouldn't be able to notice a difference when actually in game, and is exactly what we noticed when testing. Results did become a little more distant when we moved on to testing Warzone. On the highest settings at 1080p, we saw the 12700K outperformed by AMD again, but with an even bigger difference than before. This time the 5800X3D managed to pull 8 frames a second ahead of Intel, but this difference still wouldn't be that noticeable when in game. But what you probably will notice is a drop in performance of almost 30 FPS like we saw at 1440p. The 5800X3D stood far ahead of the 12700K here. Why? I don't really know. This difference is especially striking when we take a look at the results at 4K. For whatever reason, the results narrow way down to a difference of only 2 FPS. It's not uncommon for the frame rates to come closer together at higher resolutions as the GPU starts to hit its limits, but going from a small difference to a massive one and then back again is, frankly, quite strange behaviour. Moving on to Cyberpunk at the Ultra preset, the 12700K ended up with its first victory over the 5800X3D, getting an average FPS that was 15 frames higher than the average from AMD. That victory is short-lived, however, as we change the resolution to 1440p, where the 5800X3D once again steps ahead of the competition with a higher average overall, albeit only by 1 frame per second. The 1 frame difference remains at 4K, both CPUs sat at above 30 FPS, but we noticed in Cyberpunk this frame rate is bordering on unplayable. In more busy areas you could see the frame rate dropping even further down and then becoming completely unplayable. Next up, we ran Dirt 5 on the high preset, and with these settings we saw very respectable frame rates that almost hit 200 FPS at 1080p. The trend of AMD coming out ahead remains here, with the 12700K coming in 4 frames lower than the 5800X3D at 189 FPS on average. When we move up to 1440p, that 4 frames a second turns into 2, and who pulls ahead also changes, with the 12700K now being the one out in front. Both CPUs managed to stay decently ahead of 144 FPS at 1440p, which works out quite conveniently for those of you rocking the very popular option of using a 1440p 144Hz monitor, like we checked out in a previous video. Link in the description if you want to see that. 4K was still above the 100 FPS mark on both chips, with the difference in average FPS narrowing even more to just 1 frame per second, with the lead going once again to the 5800X3D. The next game we tested was Dying Light 2 at its high quality preset, and here we saw frame rates higher than 120 FPS on both CPUs at 1080p, with once again a slight lead being taken by AMD. Moving on to 1440p, we ended up losing a total of 30 FPS on both CPUs, bringing us below the 100 FPS mark. But most gamers wouldn't complain about 90 frames per second, so it's not a particularly worrisome drop. What people might complain about, however, is frame rates that are sub 60 FPS, and that's exactly what we saw at 4K. Though personally, I think as long as we're above 30 and it still feels smooth and responsive, then the 50 FPS we ended up getting here is more than acceptable, and at 4K, both CPUs managed to remain playable, with a difference of 1 FPS again being entirely unnoticeable. Back to Ubisoft with Far Cry 6, with the game set to the Ultra preset. At 1080p, we saw Intel take a small 2 FPS lead over the 5800X3D, with both CPUs sitting above 120 FPS. At 1440p, both CPUs remained above 100 FPS, and once again, AMD didn't let Intel take the lead for very long, being 1 frame per second higher on average than the 12700K. 4K was another very close result, but Intel managed to pull ahead, but only barely though, with again only a 1 frame per second difference. So in reality, they performed identically, and both CPUs also remained above 60 FPS, which is nice to see from this kind of title. Gears 5 was another title where Intel managed to gain a higher average FPS overall, this time with a 3 frame per second lead when running at 1080p. At 1440p, that lead remained at 2 frames per second higher, but things changed slightly at 4K, where we saw a pretty sudden drop in performance on both chips. And AMD then took that opportunity to gain an extra frame per second over the 12700K. Even with this large frame drop that almost halved the performance, we still managed to get above 60 FPS on both CPUs, making the game more than playable at 4K. Our figures in GTA 5 were some of the weirdest throughout testing. At 1080p, the performance seemed pretty normal, the 5800X3D getting a few frames per second higher than the 12700K, with the game set to the very highest settings we could achieve. The weirdness starts with 1440p though. Here we see both CPUs outperforming their own 1080p scores, with both CPUs reaching the hard FPS limit of 187.5 FPS. Though the weird part is how the 1080p score was lower, albeit only by 4 FPS. 4K was back to normal with frame rates that reached a maximum of what is essentially 166 FPS, with the 5800X3D getting a single frame lead over the 12700K. Something worth mentioning for GTA 5 was that despite the high scores we saw, the performance of the game felt weirdly low while testing. To record the frame rates, we use NVIDIA FrameView, which allows us to pull very precise and specific information to get the most accurate results we can. When we were using FrameView to record the FPS of the games, we noticed that the performance of this particular title felt more like it was lagging. But of course, this won't be the same for you, as when you play the game, you won't be using FrameView. Moving on from there, we went on to test the newest in the Halo franchise, Halo Infinite. This game saw a very heavy preference to AMD at 1080p with an average FPS of 211, which was 26 frames a second higher than the 12700K's average of 185. 1440p saw similar results, with the 5800X3D having an average FPS of 157, while we saw a 146 FPS average on the 12700K. Whilst the AMD CPU was still ahead, this time the frame difference was much smaller, with only 11 frames between the two CPUs. 4K narrowed the results even more, now down to only 3 FPS between both averages, though both of the CPUs still remained above 90 FPS when testing on the Ultra preset. 1080p and Horizon Zero Dawn on the Ultimate Quality preset made for an incredibly smooth experience on both CPUs, nearing 200 FPS on average with only a 2 FPS gap between them. 1440p was much of the same, with great performance, this time with both CPUs staying above the 150 FPS point, and the difference narrowing again to only 1 FPS. This performance continued at 4K as both CPUs managed to achieve close to 90 FPS, with the lowest 1% low even managing to stay above 60 FPS. Our second to last game is Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition, which we ran on the Ultra Graphics preset. The gap between the 12700K and 5800X3D was pretty large at both 1080p and 1440p, and at 1080p both CPUs had very poor 1% lows, with the 12700K being especially bad as it falls down to 34 FPS. This can make a huge difference to how a game feels to play and correlates to how bad you'll feel the game stutter. The 1% low score for the 12700K was just as poor of a showing as it was at 1080p, but the 5800X3D managed to make up some ground here and had a large improvement in its 1% lows when compared to 1080p. 4K saw the average FPS narrow down to less than 1 FPS between the CPUs. Meanwhile, AMD's 1% low had another improvement, and this time was less than 10 FPS behind the average. Intel though? Poor Intel. Here we saw a 1% low of 19 FPS, which was lower than half of its overall average FPS. The final game, Rainbow Six Siege, didn't see anywhere near those kinds of lows. At 1080p, the lowest average we saw was from the 12700K at 380 FPS, a very respectable result, that is, until we look at the average FPS from the 5800X3D, which managed a staggering 467 FPS. This means that the 5800X3D is getting just under 90 FPS higher than the Intel CPU in this test. The Intel CPU fought back as we saw the gap narrow to only 40 FPS when we bumped things up to 1440p, and 4K saw an even smaller gap of only 1 FPS, with the lower scoring 12700K getting 233 frames per second, which is still absolutely nothing to complain about. So I said it in the last video and I'll say it again, a real mixed bag of results, but predominantly we saw AMD ahead, though in most cases it was by a very, very small margin that could be deemed as margin of error, and testing again could see things move around slightly. Remember, we also have a ton of other charts where we tested in more games over on our Patreon, so definitely go and check that out. Now, when it comes to the averages as a whole, there was nothing really to grumble about with either of the processors, but it was clear to see that changing resolution really did make a big difference, especially at the higher 4K display size. Obviously, being the best is kind of only one piece of the puzzle, and so much of it comes down to pricing and what you actually get for your money. Now, based on that pricing, and this is where kind of things heavily sway, I guess, into Intel's favour. When we look at 1080p and looking at the UK pricing, the 12700K sits in a much better situation for your wallet in comparison to the 5800X3D. At 1440p, it's a very similar story, with the 12700K coming in at £2.35 per frame, while the 5800X3D sits at a more expensive £2.62. And then at 4K, we see things getting really, well, serious, with the Intel chip costing £3.47 per frame and AMD at over £4 per frame. Quite a stark difference. As we move over to the US, it's a very similar story, with Intel coming out the cheapest per frame by quite some margin at every single resolution. As I mentioned, it seems like you don't need to be the best if it's the difference between saving money, which could in theory be spent in other areas to more than make up for the performance lost, like a beefier GPU. Now, this whole video focuses on gaming, and well, that was kind of the whole point of it all. But we all know people don't simply buy a PC to game on. And generally speaking, more tasks than just gaming are why users buy PCs over consoles. It's the simple fact. And with that in mind, just like the 12900K comparison we did, I kind of feel like Intel have the upper hand here, especially given the fact that they have a slightly better upgrade path, even if rumours are flying around here, there and everywhere in regards to AMD clinging onto AM4, even after its new AM5 platform arrives. But with the ability to utilise Z690, which gives the latest features, as well as having support for DDR5, that's where things get really interesting. And maybe we'll look at, I don't know, the 5800X3D on high-speed DDR4 versus the 12700K and 12900K on sort of, lower spec DDR5. We could run these comparisons forever. Maybe that's something we'll do in the near future. Let me know in the comments section if that's something you want to see in an upcoming video. And also let me know, who do you really see as the winner here? The 5800X3D with its stellar performance, or the Intel 12700K, which managed to keep up for the most part, but comes in cheaper overall? It's a tough one to call. So, just like they say in Dragon's Den, I'm out. So what I'll do is I'll let you guys do it for me and decide. And with that, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And as I mentioned, if you want to check out more game benchmarks that we ran, along with a ton of other goodies, then consider checking out our Patreon. The link is down below. So that aside, I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.